That's not true.
The good-looking ones are over there. You're going to tell me when we're good to go on the live stream. This is the part where Jonathan Holmes tells a few good jokes. Take it away, Jonathan.
Listen, all of my jokes are pretty rough. I listened to some of yours earlier, and they're much better than mine, so.
We got a couple of dad jokes up here, I'm sure. We're good to go. Excellent. All right, so those of you who are joining us online or here in person, again, I'm Brian Dolan from WCRF Moody Radio Cleveland, and I'll be moderating our next panel discussion. This one is under the theme Biblical Counseling and the Traditional Mental Health Treatment, the role for each in the church's response to mental health needs. With us on stage, first of all, we have Jonathan Holmes, who is founder and executive director of Fieldstone Counseling. Thank you, Jonathan, for being with us today. And Dr. Jim Sells, a professor and the Hughes Endowed Chair of Mental Health and Christian Thought at Regent University.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Thank you for both being here. So I'm the layman up here, not the academic or the clinician, so I'll be taking you through some of this. One of the things I want to start with is the fundamental principle of the medical-moral divide. Okay, so you have some in the field of psychology who would say, on one extreme, it's all neurochemical, it's all behavioral, there's no choice involved, okay? Other far end of the spectrum among Christians, it's a spiritual problem, you're sinning, we just need to cast out the demon, and you'll be fine. So the reality is where? Who wants to go first?
Gray is painful. And because gray is painful, it pushes us to one easier side or the other. So I thinking things simplistically always means that I have a real clear explanation for how this happens and how we can fix it. And our solutions then are usually pretty limited and have a smaller range of effectiveness because it doesn't include all the other parts that are not being addressed, controlled, and attended to with anyone's pain.
Yeah, nuance isn't easy.
Right.
But it sounds like you're saying it's somewhere in the middle. Jonathan, is that where you are as well?
Yeah, I mean, I think what Jim is saying is so right on. I think a lot of times pastors, complexity is hard, and there is an irreducible complexity. And I was a pastor for 15 years, and I think pastors a lot of times are aiming for precision. They're aiming for clarity. They want answers that can be offered in sound bites, preaching, teaching. That's just what they're most used to. So, mental health issues can be really challenging, I think, for them sometimes. I don't think, not because they don't want to care, but sometimes they don't have the language, and a lot of times that complexity can be perplexing for them. And so that default to their strong muscle of spiritual explanations is just one that's easy to go for.
I've been thinking about when I saw that you'd be on the panel with me, a lesson you taught me, which I think will be helpful for everyone. As a layman, I got into, my family got into some counseling, my wife and I were in counseling, and I saw the value of the licensed professional. And on the air, I'm talking about how important licensure is, and you were able to gently correct me, necessarily, not that licensure isn't important, but can you talk about what you shared with me, if you remember this discussion?
I'm trying to remember where we were on, but I know I would not have corrected you, so.
It was so helpful for me because I had decided the answer is licensure. It's not necessarily the answer.
Right. I think for a lot of different people in the church, licensure and professional mental health is going to be a route that they go down. For others, just their level of comfort might be, hey, I feel most comfortable talking to somebody that I know, that I trust, where there's maybe less barriers, where maybe there's less stigma, maybe there's already an existing relationship. So for a lot of people, it's just what feels most natural, what's most available, affordable, and accessible, and that just might be resources in the church. But I definitely think that we value so much our partnerships with licensed professionals because, as we say at Fieldstone, there's oftentimes levels of complexity that exceed our level of competency. And so when that happens, we want to reach out and we want to partner well with people around us.
So can you both help us understand then, like on the scale of options available for followers of Christ, what is biblical counseling as a field and a discipline?
Well, I don't know if I'm an authority on this, but I would say I think at its best and at its core, biblical counseling is a non-licensed type of counseling that really sees Scripture as the core shaping lens for how we see people, how we see our world, for how we see what's wrong with the world, what makes it better, and what our ultimate trajectory is. I think biblical counseling, since the 1970s has been through a lot of ups and downs, but I think the best parts of the movement really aims and desires to help people with the truth of Scripture. They want to take Scripture, they want to know it well, and they want to love people well. And they do that with varying levels of background, experience, and expertise. But I think that would be one of the major characteristics that I think really drives a good and a wise expression of biblical counseling.
Good.
Dr. Sells, what about for you?
I've seen biblical counseling grow and mature, and we've talked about complexity become more and more complex. One of the unfortunate uses of the idea of biblical counseling is that then everybody else is not.
Right.
And so,
Absolutely.
what if you're not a biblical counselor, then are you an anti-biblical counselor?
Right. Are you a
non-biblical
satanic counselor or something?
A biblical counselor? What are you if you're not this?
Right. Yeah.
But this has a shading and a depth in how one applies a hermeneutic.
Yeah.
And sometimes even the hermeneutic of the interpretational methods of a biblical counselor, sometimes it's narrow and sometimes it's very broad, and that is a reflection of the individual's theology.
Right. Right.
So you can have a biblical literalist that and in theological terms we used to call that, or still call that, proof texting.
Yeah.
There is a scripture that is to be applied here. Thou shalt not.
Yeah.
And that tends to have like really bad outcomes in terms of just how well that is internalized into a person's life as they seek to mature from their pain. And then there's another, like I seek to be like whole text integrative in how we do our biblical methodology. So I tend to I love the word biblical counseling, and I love to apply it to a whole bunch of different people that look very different when they sit down and work with people.
Yeah. Like most things, it's, well, what do you mean when you talk about biblical counseling? And those questions oftentimes could receive different answers, and a lot of people use that label and use it in different ways. Yeah. So.
Well, help us understand the scale of this. Like, biblical counseling to me could be as simple as you meet with a pastor, you've got a personal problem, they share a verse and some theology that help you. But there's somebody who might be dealing with longer term, maybe depression or trauma. So what's the scope of biblical counseling?
I think depending on who you talk to, you probably could get a range on that, but I would say my conversations with pastors, probably more the former of what you described, maybe briefer, short-term, pointed conversations, people seeking help, typically related to spiritual problems. Rachel Den Hollander, who did a lot of work in this area and presented a report to the PCA, noted that oftentimes when people are experiencing some of these problems in life, pastors are one of the first places that they'll go to. But then after that, they oftentimes rank at the bottom of people who are actually really helpful and trustworthy. And so I do think sometimes pastors, for whatever reasons, maybe it's time restraints, schedule, lack of education, might be good in that 1 to 2 sessions of helping maybe initially triage something, but a lot of times they don't tend to like to get involved in, more long-term care. And so I'd love to see the church do a little bit more educationally with pastors to help them with some of those skills, but oftentimes that's just not a part of their training and their education in seminary.
So then what types of problems or issues would you say would be a good fit for a biblical counselor?
All of them.
All of them, okay.
I wouldn't say, oh, this I would not send to that, or this I would not send to them. Because there are some, and the same would be true for a clinical psychologist or a licensed professional counselor. Like, if my son or daughter, if my wife, if I am in need, I want to attend to someone, have someone attend to me or them, who will understand me, who will help me in my or their wholeness, including my walk with Jesus and my ability to recognize my own sin and my ability to recognize the how I have come to manage my pain, and that might be the biblical counselor, or that might be a licensed counselor. As you go up in the psychopathology realm, you probably will need to have someone who is more averse to the diversities of psychology and or psychiatry, depending on how much limitation in life the person is exhibiting in their respective needs.
Yeah, so then when you have, let's just say, a pastor or a lay leader, somebody comes to them, they're struggling with some sort of issue in their life with mental health. How do you know when it's time to refer to a clinical professional versus perhaps a biblical counselor? Is there a clear line?
Yeah, probably not, just because, again, we're dealing with so much complexity. I'd say my general rule of thumb, though, is what I said earlier about when the level of complexity exceeds my layer of competency, time to not do a handoff, but a partnership, a collaboration. And that, again, I think is so much of what we've been talking about here at this conference is it's not a this or a that, but how can we better partner together? How can we know mental health professionals that attend our church, that live in our community? How can we meet them for lunch, learn more about who they are, so that when we are making good referrals, they're a referral and a partnership, not a handoff. It's not an abrogation of care, but it's a partnership in that process. And I honestly think that takes a lot of work for people in the church. It takes effort, it takes intentionality to say, yeah, I'm going to go out there and I'm going to meet these people. I want to hear I want to hear what they do, so that I can have an increased level of confidence when I'm referring these people. Yeah. So yeah, like Jim said, I want to refer people to whomever are going to be most helpful in the moment.
Yeah, it seems that as a psychologist, I know something about personality disorder that maybe a biblical counselor might not know. And the biblical counselor, in working with person A, B, or C, might seek to bring the deep and deeply cherished faith tradition into these persons' lives, without knowing some of the ground game of what's going on in the psychology of someone with personality disorder. They might not understand why it keeps blowing up. And so there is that's what Jonathan's saying around the level of complexity. So if we're dealing with, if we are not moving forward at a healthy pace towards the reduction of the need or the amplification of the growth, the maturity, then I would say probably like up the credentialing of the person. And that might be, we might see this within a couple of months of, wow, I think we should have made more progress here.
And now in my work in Christian media, I've become an advocate as much as I can for mental health care. And I encounter one issue all the time that seems pretty controversial for Christians, so I'll make you answer it.
Okay.
We have a dramatic need for mental health care. We have a shortage of clinicians. And we have a lot of Christians who have been told and decided they will only see a biblical counselor. But they may need acute help. Should Christians be going to secular clinicians? Or should we only be going to biblical counselors? Or Christian licensed professionals?
Right. Yeah. I don't know. I mean, it's, again, depending on the situation and depending on the nature of the problem, I probably could answer that in a variety of different ways. I think to something that Jim, I think, was intimating at earlier, I think maybe my first few questions at the front end, licensure aside, credentialing aside, is who is this person that I'm going to see? And at the core, are they a person who is a good listener? Are they a person who demonstrates an ability to listen, to ask good questions, that you're not just another client, another person on their docket, another person on their schedule, but is the person that they are bringing into the counseling session to establish that relationship of trust, who is that person? Do they really care? And that is where I think getting to know the professionals in your area is so important. I've met many secular clinicians who excel in those areas, right? Christians don't have like a monopoly on it, as it were, of being empathetic or good question askers or good listeners. And so, when we're thinking about those referrals or where do we send people, the licensure question I think is important, but I wouldn't want to sidestep it if that was a strong concern from somebody in my church, but I'd want to say, well, tell me about what kind of person you're looking for. And that would be a little bit more helpful for me in guiding where that referral or recommendation would go.
Yeah. I've trained counselors for 30 years, almost half of which have been in secular institutions and half of which have been in faith-based schools. And the folks that I trained when I was a professor at Northern Illinois University do really, really good work. And I think when it comes to helping someone with their anxiety, they have fear and overwhelming threat at the idea of walking to their mailbox. Any clinician can help with the reduction of those symptoms. Now, I don't know that some of those clinicians would be able to help them understand their anxiety within the context of their whole life and their purpose of being on earth as a child of God, loved by God, created for mission. And now that's another level of need that this person might benefit from a Christian collaborating around their emerging identity as a person, as it is affecting this thing of anxiety. But the reduction of the symptom I don't want to say that's an amoral thing, but that is within the realm of anyone who might be willing to attend to care.
And see, as we're talking about this, I'm wondering how much just the general lack of competency in basic psychology that our churches and leaders were lacking, so that we don't know what to do in these circumstances. So how do we build competency in our churches and mental health?
Well, we could talk all day about that. I think that there is a significant lack of maybe just some of those basic people helping skills. And I also think that's probably just by nature of the way churches work. They tend to be very didactic in their teaching. It's very teaching and discipleship oriented. So it's a lot of talking to other people or directing people, maybe not as conversational, maybe not as engaging of other people, practicing some of those listening skills. So I think the church just by nature doesn't tend to set itself up well, I think, to train people in those kinds of activities. So I think there's a lot of different programs, there's a lot of different things that could be done to help, what I would just say, raise the IQ level a little bit in churches across the country and across the world. And I think that you see a lot of those different programs and different things taking place and bearing some really good fruit.
Yeah.
How do you recommend pastors and church leaders vet various mental health professionals in order to have good referrals? Because you don't want to send, as a pastor, one of your parishioners to somebody who's going to do some damage spiritually.
Mm-hmm. Have lunch. And have regular lunch or regular coffee, and I hope the pastor doesn't jettison their role as being pastoral to a clinician who cannot be pastoral. The clinician is targeting the reduction and elimination of symptoms. They are not nurturing a soul. They're not caring for this person on the other 6 days a week. They don't have a trajectory of their whole life and their whole family system. They're helping that individual address the needs of their dying parents or their emerging adolescents. They have a specific, very narrow role in their life. And the role of the pastor in that person's life and the role of the church still remains, in my opinion, much larger and much more influential than the reduction of these symptoms that are being addressed by the clinician.
It sounds to me like it ought to almost be an integrated role of some sort. But I would imagine that there's some ethical boundaries for a counselor in terms of what they can share with a pastor. How do they navigate that as they're trying to minister to someone who they will see the rest of the week, who's receiving professional care?
Yeah. How do you do it?
Well, I mean, ethics and confidentiality, that's so important in counseling. So, professional counselors have codes of ethics, informed consent, et cetera, that help, I think, really guard the privacy of a counseling relationship. Pastors and church leaders, again, typically don't think in those categories, but they're still important. And so for pastors and lay leaders who are wanting to come alongside people who are in professional counseling, and that's been disclosed to them, it's, for me at least, it would be simple questions like, what could I do to be helpful to you in this process? What would be ways that we as a church and as a team might practically help you, serve you, aid you in this area? And let them be able to voice whatever level of involvement that they might like to have. To Jim's point about, and to your question, Brian, about pastors and referrals and vetting, I do think it's as simple as getting to know people, taking them out to lunch for coffee. Recently, I was at a church doing something related to counseling and met a couple of people from that church who were licensed professionals. There was a social worker, a marriage and family therapist, and I mentioned it to the pastor later, and he said, "Oh, really?" He said, I didn't even know we had, licensed mental health professionals in our church." And I said, "Yeah, you obviously do." I would pursue them, get to know them, find out what they do. And I think sometimes pastors think that mental health professionals are doing like this, magical work and, this back room and white lab coats. And it just remains so mysterious. And so instead of entering into that with curiosity, we kind of stay away and maybe make assumptions. So just get to know the people in your church who are already doing this and go from there.
Yeah. The idea of informed consent and confidentiality is owned by the client, by the person. And that as you share with me your story, Brian, it's still your story. And I have no right to disclose that story to anyone because it's your story. Mm-hmm. Unless you give me permission and to share that story with another so that it benefits you. Yeah. And as a professional, I'm going to say, if we have this conversation and you say, "You can tell my pastor everything," I might say, "Okay, let's put limits on everything because everything is not in your best interest, probably." So what would be in your best interest so that I can help him be more effective in his care towards you, so that you become the beneficiary of both of our involvements in your life.
Yeah. Yeah. Very good. I'm trying to think of another end of this, which would be, I guess I've seen some churches that are well-intentioned, that want to care for people who are hurting, that don't know that they're doing more damage than good.
Yeah.
So talk to the pastor or church leader who wants to have some biblical counseling among lay leaders in their church. What do you look for in someone who doesn't have the credentials that both of you have, but want to care for people? It takes more than just loving people and knowing some verses.
Yeah.
So what do you look for?
My first, maybe a non-professional criteria is, one, people who can keep their mouth shut. Two, people who value other people's experience over their own opinion. If you do those two things, along with being able to just to sit well with other person's pain without being overwhelmed with it, those three things then take you a long way.
I'd echo a lot of that and just simply add pastors who know how to listen. Again, their default is to speak. I mean, that's what they're paid for. Their whole livelihood in many ways depends on them speaking and speaking often and speaking frequently. So the awkwardness and the silence that sometimes comes into counseling, I would want to know that the pastor's able to handle that. Another thing, and we're hearing a lot about this, is just better self-awareness, better emotional intelligence on the place of pastors, where we want to know Scripture well, but we want to know people well too. And knowing people well in so many ways starts with knowing our own selves well. And so a level of self-awareness, not that it leads towards navel-gazing and self-introspection to where it's unhelpful, but a real self-knowledge that really begins in light of knowledge of who the Lord is. But yeah, I know a lot of pastors who make really good counselors who care really well for people in their church. So,
to what extent can we use compassionate congregants as biblical counselors?
Great question.
I think there's been a lot of work done on this in terms of the effectiveness of what we might call paraprofessionals or lay counselors or lay leaders, and they do tend to be quite effective. Again, I think because for many people, especially who are embedded within a local church or a faith tradition, it's accessible. People are knowable. There's already a pre-existing relationship of trust. There are perhaps less hurdles in reaching out to this person who they know through Bible study or through a community group. So for some of those just everyday boilerplate problems of life that every single human being experiences because we are sinners and we live in a broken world, lay leaders in the church are going to be helpful. Again, but churches, I think it's incumbent on them to provide opportunities for ongoing education, training, and really equipping, which when you look at Ephesians 4, I mean, that is something that is supposed to be happening in the church, is being equipped for the work of ministry. And so that means that you have to look out for different places, organizations, programs, et cetera, I think that can bring in that kind of training to help your lay leaders and people in the church.
Yeah. Much of what I do right now is trying to create solutions, creating solutions to address the absence of sufficient mental health care at the professional level, at the highest level. And the simplest way to do that is to reinforce the lay level caregivers in every congregation to attend to modest to functional levels of life pain. Mm-hmm. Like everybody hurts, and everybody can benefit from a therapist, but they don't necessarily need the therapist. They need someone who can listen well, that can walk with them in pain, because much of the pain that we are addressing is not going to have a simple solution that, if you do three things here, 1, 2, and 3, this will be gone in the next 2 weeks. No, you're going to be walking with your son or daughter with their gender identity confusion for the next 30 years. And that lay person that can be with another is incredibly powerful. So the power and the effectiveness of that person to collaborate with pastor, to collaborate with clinician, is I see the primary way we can reduce the mental health crisis that we have. And that's a shameless plug. I'm going to talk more about that this afternoon in the quick talk and the lecture tomorrow with Jen Ripley. So,
well, for many, even having this discussion, if you would have, rolled back time 15 years ago, we all would be a bunch of radicals up here having this conversation.
Yeah.
And I keep hearing kind of like that 10-year mark. About 10 years ago, something happened where the church became more open to the idea of more professional psychology. What happened 10 years ago? Have you figured this out? Like, why the openness in the last decade to this?
I don't know. I mean, I don't know if it's 10 years, but I do know a lot of people start marking dates with, say, when the iPhone comes out in the market in 2008, and you read Jonathan Haidt's book, An Anxious Generation, and you see a lot of mental health problems specifically amongst Gen Z, and you look at a lot of the statistics and the charts, and sometime between 2008, 2010, you just start seeing those line graphs significantly go up. So again, I don't know if that alone is the sole cause. I hope in the best of ways it's more conversation, it's less stigma, it's pastors and other well-known people being a little bit more honest, a little bit more vulnerable about mental health issues so that people aren't suffering in the dark. I hope that it's because pastors are actually talking about things like depression and suicide and anxiety in their sermons. So I would hope that, more positively speaking, some of this is because of just more increased awareness in the church and people being open to talking about it.
Yeah. I have nothing to add. Jonathan, you said that really well.
That's fascinating. I was picturing it was going to be, there's, ex-pastors came out saying they're depressed and they're getting treatment. But you're saying perhaps the pain threshold reached a point where we all knew there was a problem.
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely examples that we could sit here and name of pastors who have been open about their mental health struggles and been really honest about that and maybe led the way. But again, it's also probably just everyday people in the church who oftentimes go unnoticed, who are hopefully talking about these things as well and coming alongside. I also think that just the language of counseling seems to be much more popularized today, and in general called therapy speak. So you just have certain terms being utilized a lot more by people, perhaps than there were 10 or 15 years ago. Words like trauma, for instance, has been so popularized in ways in our culture, for good and for bad, that mental health issues are just much more conversationally available to people than perhaps they were a while ago.
You can see over a 40-year period a gradual incline in almost every mental health category, accelerating slightly more steeply around 2008, and then accelerating even more around 2015, and even steeper during COVID. And whether or not we will bend and level off post-COVID, it's too early to see and to be able to make any real clear explanation or projection as to where we're going now. But this trend has been emerging, and that's prompted, again, very easy explanations. It's the divorce rate, or it's the Jonathan hates the rise of the cell phone and technology in the anxious generation, or it can be attributed to a host of different things, to which all of them likely have some contribution to the need.
To what extent can we credit the advances of evidence-based psychology as opposed to, from my parents' generation and before, mental health care was laying on a couch complaining about your mother, right? I mean,
it's kind of ironic. The evidence-based therapies have demonstrated incredible effectiveness, but yet we still grow in the need. So our treatments are better, and the need becomes greater even with the better treatments. So that means it's being pushed by a very large engine that's even bigger than our tools that we have to address this thing.
And then, as you think about evidence-based psychology, and the more we learn about the human brain in the last few decades, science says one thing about it. As men who love Jesus, how are you seeing God's fingerprint in your field as we learn more and more about the human brain?
Well, I think if anything, it leads us to a deep appreciation of our Creator and the way that He designed and created us. And when you read a lot of the people who are in the upstream of psychiatry and psychology, there is a humble admission of the brain is incredibly complex. It's not like we've mastered it or we know everything that's going on, either good or bad inside of it. We maybe have more studies, more scans, more ability, but there is still a level of mystery of what is happening there that even remains unbeknownst to us. And to me, I think that is in credit to our Creator, who has wonderfully designed us and created us, and that there are going to be complexities within the brain, within our body, that this side of heaven we're probably never going to fully unravel or understand. But yeah, the advances that have been made, I think, have been significantly helpful, right? In terms of, how our body responds to threats, how our brain, our sympathetic and our parasympathetic nervous system is designed and reacts. That level of education that now is maybe more available to the average person, in some ways can be helpful for many.
What about the area of trauma? Because I know, Jonathan, you've done a bunch of work in that. I don't know your work as intimately. What do pastors and leaders need to know about the impact of what trauma is and its impact on people's well-being? Because I think for a lot of people, trauma is, and I've heard this before, right? It is the soldier in the jungles of Vietnam. That's trauma. My parents' divorce, which they're not divorced, by the way, but that's not trauma. Quit your crying about that.
Originally, in DSM at DSM-3 and DSM-4, trauma was defined as the former. Some gross violence witnessed, experienced by a person. Now we are seeing in our outcome studies that the same brain effect is present in people who have had long-standing, low-level pain experiences, and so the definition of trauma gets bigger as we see the effects of different experiences on the brain. So it's not that we have a wishy-washy definition of trauma. Trauma now means everything. No, we're seeing the same kinds of outcomes in various subpopulations that have common experiences, such that someone who lives in a life of perpetual stress as children, the unknown of instability of mom and dad, the fight that's going to happen again tonight. They might not be yelling at me, and that might not be happening every night, but that child who has a perpetual sense is showing similar signs in their adult life experience as that person that had more of the I experienced this horrendous and horrific event in my life. So the brain, the limbic system reactivity to any kind of threat, either a horrific threat or a threat over time, seems to have significant effect on brain development, and then on the behavior and the emotional, the cognitive interpretation of events. All those things kind of line themselves up like dominoes and start falling down.
Yeah, there are so many people here that could speak so much deeper on this issue of trauma, but I'll just mention one bridge that oftentimes is difficult for people in the church, especially pastors, to cross with trauma is that, again, words that we don't immediately find and locate in Scripture can feel foreign to us. And so, pastors, as they're reading and teaching Scripture, they're saying, well, I don't see trauma in the Bible. I don't see that word. And so it can feel like an abstraction. It can feel like a quote-unquote psychologized term that just now everybody's using to describe everything from, hey, I didn't get my burger the way that I wanted, to extreme suffering. And so we can be dismissive of that. And so I'd say, yeah, the word trauma might not be in the Bible, but the experiences of it in the rich descriptions of life in a broken, fallen, evil world where evil things happen to us, Scripture is very vivid in speaking about those things if we are able to see it and really delve into that experience. And so, again, my encouragement to pastors who are seeking to be more trauma-informed and seeking to be better caregivers is read Scripture and know people. Listen to those experiences. Don't bypass them. Don't dismiss them just because you find that word to just be some word that is culturally popular right now. So, especially in the church, I feel like we have a lot of room to grow in that area.
Well, and as we talk about those various things for pastors and leaders listening, and even the average congregant, to what extent do you see in your work emotional health tied to one's spiritual health? How are those correlated? And to help with that, I've heard one counselor friend indicate to me that they're directly correlated. That if you are not emotionally healthy, your spiritual health will suffer.
Yeah, my first thought would be, tell me what emotionally healthy means to you. If emotionally healthy is this, my world's going okay, I'm in touch with my feelings, and I'm living out of my feelings, I want to inquire a little bit more. But I think in the way that you're describing it, I would think yes. I do think emotional health, as Scripture defines it and talks about it, is directly related to our spiritual health, because we're embodied beings. We can't abstract out these various parts of who we are without talking about all of the different parts. So we hear things in our world, things that are going on inside of us, people in our world, all of that confluence of events impacting and affecting us. And again, the best place to go, I think, in Scripture is the Psalms, where you see that dynamic interplay, where you see things happening to people physically, relationally, circumstantially, in so many different ways, impacting either positively or negatively people's spiritual health and relationship with the Lord.
Yeah, really like how you described that. And we know so many people who may not know Jesus, do not know Jesus, but are mature adults. They manage their emotions well. They are not prone to overreactivity or hyperreactivity, and they have a deep love and appreciation for their lives and for those people around them, and they live well. They have to do something with the concept of eternity, with the concept of why am I here on the earth, who put me here, and what role do I play in, and everybody has to create some kind of explanation, and that may or may be very effective. I likened it to a metaphor of a bucket, and you have people who have they haven't thought through all those spiritual complex issues, and so their bucket is very, very small. They can't hold much in it, and when life pain overwhelms them, they're more prone to having their bucket overwhelmed. Other people might have very big buckets, but they're not very faithful in attending to it. And maybe that small bucket person is someone who hasn't really integrated the depth of the meaning of a life with Jesus and the meaning of their purpose on earth. It's a very, very small container. Other people have a big container, but it's got all kinds of holes in it, and they don't really attend to patching the holes, and so it leaks terribly. So they understand Jesus, they understand Christianity, but they haven't addressed the attention to the bucket necessary, so it leaks really bad. And that is, I would say, that immature person who is of faith but is relatively shallow or has a lot of holes in their bucket, so they can't really manage the stress of life, that they could if they just took care of all the details and the disciplines of managing their bucket well.
As we get close to wrapping up here, talk to the pastor or church leader whose church is not doing much in the area of mental health, but they're feeling inspired to care more and do more.
Yeah.
What's step one?
A lot of times when I'm speaking at different churches and pastors are asking me that, hey, we want to do something, how do we get started? I'll just ask a question. I'll just say, what is the current process right now in your church? If someone did need help, what would they do? just to see if a pastor even knows what are current pathways that people in their church are receiving care. Is it they talk to somebody at leadership? Do they just get a referral? And then the second question I ask people, or I ask pastors, is I say, where are people going for help? Who do people in your congregation naturally tend to gravitate towards? Who are the wise older people that after church on a Sunday, there's 3 or 4 young moms talking to this older woman? Because I'd want to learn from them, right? They're already doing this and doing it somewhat informally. So knowing what are the current pathways for care in your church, and for some they might say, oh, well, now that we've done this audit, there's actually none. Well, let's start creating some of those. And then secondly, who are the people in your church who are doing this well, and learn from them?
Really would totally support what you just described. So let me add something on a slightly different space. I think that's really good for creating ministry for the people that have modest to significant mental health need. There's this other big group of people underneath, and that's everybody else. And everybody else, everybody else has pain. Everybody else mismanages their emotions. Everybody else is overwhelmingly discouraged or fearful at times. Everybody else wants to throw the toaster through the kitchen window at times. And most of the time they manage to refrain from such activity, but they still carry very, very intense emotion and they don't know what to do with it. And the church's capacity to say, that's us, that's all of us. And the people in the church to be able to say, that's me. And to say that is not then to place me on a level of greater severity. To say that is to place me on a pathway where that potential of severity is reduced.
All right, let's thank Jonathan Holmes and Dr. Jim Sells for their great responses today. Thank you very much, gentlemen. I think we have to reset for the next thing.